Man of the tombs, he lives in a place where no one goes, and he tears at himself and lives with a pain that no one knows. He counts himself dead among the living. He knows no mercy and no forgiving. Deep in the night, he's driven to cry out loud. Can you hear him cry out loud? Man of the tombs, possessed by an unseen enemy, he breaks every chain and mistakes his freedom for being free. Shame and shamelessness equally there, like a random toss of a coin in the air.
Jesus, Son of the Most High God, what do you want with me? I beg you, don't punish me.
What is your name?
Legion. Lord, we beg you, do not send us into the abyss. Let us enter into the herd of swine.
Down at the shoreline, two sets of footprints meet. One voice is screaming, other voice begins to speak. In only a moment and only a word, the evil departs like a thundering herd. Man of the tombs, he hears this cry out loud. Underneath this thing that you've become, I see a man of flesh and blood. I give you life beyond the grave. I heal your heart, I come to save. No need to fear, be not afraid. This man of sorrows knows your pain. I come to take away your sin and bear its marks upon my skin. When no one can touch you, still I can. For Son of God I am. Dressed now and seated, clean in spirit and healthy of mind, man of the tombs, he begs to follow but must stay behind. He'll return to his family with stories to tell of mercy and madness, of heaven and hell. Man of the tombs I was.
Depending on the version of the Alpha course that we do, they can change the focus and the topics a little bit. And Ron was good enough to make sure I had their topics and sequences of doing it, but as I was looking in, there was a question I couldn't resist that they brought up after the day away. One focus they might have taken was this: how to make the most of the rest of your life. And there's something, no matter who you are, where you think you are with the Lord, that question is going to be, never goes away. How are you sitting there right now? You're going to get up in a little while, probably 3 hours. Just kidding. So you should have seen the fear on people's faces. You're going to get up in a little while, and you're going to go and you're going to make the most of the rest of your life, and you get up the next day and the next day, and you're going to make the most of the rest of your life. How does a person make the most of the rest of their life from this point on? Now, this is where the story comes in, that we had to really live in this for a moment, because if we were going to take a biblical story and deal with something that was the most worst case scenario you could think of, and see how someone made the most of the rest of their life, it would be this guy. It would be this guy that we were looking at. Here he is, as the story goes on, that this guy had, the name he used was Legion because there were so many demons in him. And the fact that he lived among the tombstones, he lived in the cemetery. And he lived in a town they think was probably Gergesa, which is an interesting thing. This is just kind of an incidental point, but if you see up there in the top across the Sea of Galilee, Magdala was directly across on the other side, and that's, of course, if you remember Mary Magdalene, that's her hometown, right across from each other, and of course she was delivered from 7 demons herself. So it's kind of interesting how that whole thing is in the same area there. But this man was filled with demons, and the dynamic in a story doesn't change, because, you know, whether you're talking about your own sin nature, your own fallen nature, or you're talking about how Satan wreaks havoc on your life and my life, because there is a devil and there is a dark side, spiritual side going on. It starts with what happens to this guy, robbed of every shred of dignity. Isn't it interesting? You look at it, sin, fallen nature, Satan. It always comes down to this idea, this condition of robbing us of our human dignity. In the case of this guy, he didn't wear any clothes, and if you know how uptight the Hebrew culture was about wearing clothes, it's amazing. He lived like an animal. He was out there living among the dead and attacking the living. And he was actively hurting himself. It says he cut himself with sharp rocks and such. He was couldn't be restrained. They tried to restrain him. And then the next thing, he'd break free. He'd be back out there running around naked again in the graveyard, cutting himself with stones and scaring people. Can you imagine, if you were a local, what the impression would be when you come in this place where this guy sat? You know, there's Joe, you know, so, oh yes, that's out in the graveyard, you know. He would have had this whole reputation thing going on. And probably there was laughter about him that would go on. Probably there was a whole lot of loathing going on. And definitely you didn't want to run into him on a dark night, out by the graveyard. There was a lot of fear of him going on. So this guy is caught in this type of life until he crossed paths. There was Bob Bennett's song going on in there. If you ever, this is some of the most beautiful lyrics on this passage I think you've ever heard. The idea of meeting on the shoreline there, and their paths cross, and then there is this dramatic healing. And what's interesting, it seems it was so dramatic that these Gerasenes there, they feared his salvation more than they feared his evil when he had it. They got used to the evil. They just kind of stayed clear of him. But they couldn't understand what power could deliver someone from this level of fallenness. So here's the question. We've got this guy. He's delivered from this horrible position in life. Now he's in a state of his right mind. What does he do with the rest of his life? What does somebody like that do with the rest of their life? Or probably even a more important question is, what would his Savior have him do with the rest of his life? How could he make the most of the rest of his life? Now, as we look at it, like I say, this is a worst-case scenario, and you always can learn a lot of stuff from a worst-case scenario, right? And what we find, what the interchange that goes on between Christ and this guy, Jesus really gives him 4 starts, I'll call them, 4 starts that will allow him to make the most of the rest of his life, and we can learn from it. By the end of the story, as usual, you can see that when I give you the scripture on that little guide sheet, I highlight different things, and near the end of the story, around verse 35, the nutshell of it is this. The man's delivered, the demons go out, he's found sitting at the feet of Jesus, he's in his right mind. The locals are so scared they ask Jesus to leave, they're overcome with fear. The man from whom the demons have gone out begs Jesus to go with them, and Jesus sends him away saying, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So what are the four starts that I'm pulling from this? Let me start with this one. Number 1 start, to make the most of your life and my life based on this scenario would be this. Start at the feet of Jesus. Start at the feet of Jesus. Anyone who is saved, anybody who has come to a living relationship, who is in a position with God, this dynamic, Jesus returns the human dignity that we lost. And he restores it, but ironically, it starts in a very humble place. It starts at the feet of Jesus, not at his head, not at his hands. It starts at the feet of Jesus. Thinking of how many ways, when you think of a fallen person in our fallen nature, how many ways and how many forms we can be stripped of our dignity. Take somebody who is completely given to our natural self, or take someone who is given very strongly to whatever Satan's manipulating in their life. We find that we become petty. We become small. We become uncontrolled. We become undirected. We become unkind, thick-headed, dishonest, blind, self-defeating, self-harming. All of these things come to mind. And it makes sense because, you see, in a fallen state, what you and I are in a nutshell is we are not what we were designed to be. And if you're not what you were designed to be, then there's less dignity in that. Just inherently, there's less dignity. And it's not just your dignity. Chances are your influence on other people is stripping them of dignity too in some direction. So Jesus restores this fellow. And the position we find him in when he's restored is at the feet of Jesus. At the feet. Think of that for a moment. What does it mean to be at the feet of someone? If you were sitting at the feet of so-and-so who is a teacher or a master in something, that's essentially what it is, isn't it? That person is a master. That person is the go-to. That person is the authority above all other authorities, and you're sitting at their feet. And wow, we like to think, oh, that's where Jesus is for me. That's where the Christ is. I'm a Christian and Jesus is Lord and I'm sitting at his feet. But, you know, sometimes I don't know if we get the full appreciation of that. You know, because the most mistaken people in the world aren't those who don't believe in God at all. It is those who believe just enough. You know, they're not quite at the feet. God is just this ingredient that they put in with everything else. Well, I believe this, and I believe that, and I have this and that, and you know, and God's just one ingredient in this personal mix. That is probably the greatest mistake we can make. Unfortunately, we find a lot of it in places just like this. Yeah, here it is. This is a little bit of my God time, and then when I go out, there's something else out there just, or even more important than God himself. But for this man and his recovery and his healing and his most of the rest of his life, it started at the feet of Jesus, the master, the authority, truly above everything else, above his work, above his personal whatever thoughts he had. He was above everything else. Because you know what? For him, maybe it was easy in that way because he was delivered and nothing else had the power to do that. But for all of us, it's going to start there. It starts at the feet of Jesus. Very humble place to make the most of the rest of your life. The number 2 thing dovetails with this. It starts from the transformation. Now, this guy became someone else. All of these demons that were in him, they were removed. He became someone else. He became who he should be and who he was meant to be, but he becomes someone else. This wasn't a self-improvement project. Jesus didn't show up and just give a little bit of counseling or a little bit of therapy. This was a complete transformation of this individual. And we know from his situation, it had to be that way. There was no use putting a Sunday best clothes on this fellow. He wouldn't keep them on. He needed to be transformed. The thing is, so do we. The trouble with us is it might not be as a dramatic or obvious a thing, but so do we. Here's something that's a little bit hard to wrap our mind around. It's not hard with our physical eyes or our imaginations to see how evil this fellow was and how much of God's power must have been there to do what was done. But you know what? The same fallen nature in this man is the one that's in you and me. The same destiny where this guy was going, that's where we were all headed as well. We're really not all that different. As a matter of fact, the same power, the same divine intercession that it took to save this guy with a legion of demons in him is what you and I need for our own deliverance. It took the cross. It took the same life of God. We need as much a miracle as that man, that demon-possessed man does. It's just hard to wrap our mind around that sin is sin and evil is evil. And we all need the same deliverance, which means we need the same transformation. If I said to you that let's bring in this demon-possessed man and ask him to sit quietly in the service, you said, you got to be kidding. Don't even bring him in here. But the truth is, the transformation for him is the same one we need, or we're wasting our time. It was when he was transformed, he was then, it said, in his right mind. Do you know that you and I are not in our right minds? Looking at Ashley's looking at me, she's going, you're never in your right mind. But the truth of it is, in the spiritual side, it's true that in our fallen state, we were never in our right minds. None of us. Maybe not as dramatic as this guy, but none of us are. Romans 12:2 talks about that. It says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not be conformed, but be transformed. In our natural selves, leave ourselves to our own natural reasoning, and you know what? We come to wrong conclusions. We come with wrong values. We perceive things in the wrong way. We go to war with each other. We break our marriages. We take what's not ours, and we envy somebody else for what they have. We even do ourselves harm. How many lives are in a situation of self-sabotage? Either deliberate or not deliberate. It's just one of those things. How different is that than some demon-possessed man out there cutting himself with rocks in the graveyard? It's all not that different. As I was thinking of this particular area of when we are in a fallen state, there was an article from the University of Wisconsin. I thought, wow, this really kind of touches a point here. And it was a particular research being done in psychology. And I'll read you a little bit of this article. And the article goes like this. After a decade of studying teens' use and misuse of technology, Dr. Justin Patchen did not think there was anything adolescents could do online that would surprise him. Turns out he was wrong. A surprising and alarming number of middle and high school age youth are posting, sending, or in other ways sharing online hurtful content about themselves, according to Patchen's latest research, a first of its kind study on, get this, here's a new term for you, digital self-harm among adolescents. Quote, I was shocked to think that this was even a possibility, says Patchen, a criminal justice professor at the University of Wisconsin. I've been studying cyberbullying a long time, and it's never occurred to me that someone would post harmful things about themselves until I heard about a 14-year-old girl in England who committed suicide after sending hateful messages to herself. Wow, cyberbullying yourself. Who would have thunk it, right? Well, stripped of dignity. How different is that than the man in the tombs? The new modern age version of it. Some of us may not hurt ourselves intentionally, but I tell you what, we all got our own brand of crazy. There is something in the flaws in ourself that, you know what, without the transformation that is needed, you know, we're just not going to get there. The sin nature needs to be removed. We can act churchy, but it really doesn't mean a thing. We need transformation. It comes in two stages too, by the way, if you catch it in there. The first part is not to be conformed. Not to be conformed to the pattern of this world. Now think about it, for all the creepiness, for all the Halloweeniness of this man in the tombs, basically he was being shoved in a mold. He was being conformed. Yes, first supernaturally by these demons, but how about the locals around him? Do you think that maybe he carried a label? Do you think that maybe he was just known as that hopelessly evil guy, that hopelessly crazy guy? And in time, isn't it interesting, when you wear a label long enough, it just seems to fit very nicely, and you can stay in that label. For us, how many labels might we be allowing? How many labels might we even buy into? As the world tries to conform us, are you that old person? Are you that stupid person? Are you that crazy Christian person that kind of has those weird beliefs? Are you that person that really doesn't matter much? That person who really couldn't do much in life even if they tried? How much of a label do we allow? You know, it's pretty hard, isn't it, to fight you against the world? But God doesn't expect us to fight against the world on our own. The idea is that we don't get conformed to the world by using His power, by submitting to His, by being at His feet. We don't conform to the world. That's stage one. Then stage two is to be transformed, is being transformed. Interesting thing in the wording of this is in the Greek, the word that's used for being transformed in Romans chapter 12 is actually the word transfigured. And that kind of changes things, right? Because any Christian who reads the Bible and you hear the word transfigured, you automatically go to the Mount of Transfiguration. And you think of that. Jesus was transfigured. And what happened in that story? Well, in this story, he takes a couple of his closest homies. That's the Steve Anderson version of Scripture. Anyway, he takes his closest guys. He goes up on this mountain and he shows them what he really looks like, who he really is. It says his clothes, he was as radiant as the sun. And Peter just started babbling. He was so blown away by what was going on up there. The same word, transfigured, is used for the Christian. As a matter of fact, 2 Corinthians 3:18, Paul's talking to the church there. He says that we're supposed to be transfigured into the likeness of Christ. That's what's available to you and I. And that goes far beyond the labels of what the world tries to put on us. You know, you might remember that saying, it's maybe way too popular, is that some people are so heavenly minded they're no earthly good, right? And we worry about that when people are too much into the whole mountaintop experience of things. But the truth is, it's not that we become so heavenly minded we're no earthly good. It's that we finally become so truly good that we're of real use on this earth. That's what it's about. You and I don't know true goodness until we're transformed. Oh yeah, you have a human standard you might live by. But you and I do not understand true goodness until we are transformed, until we are transfigured into the likeness of Christ. Now we've got something to show the world. Now we have a way not to be conformed, but transformed. The number 3 in all of this is start where you are, move, but don't run away. Start where you are, move, but don't run away. How does that work? Well, let's go back to this guy. I want you to put yourself in his place. You know, God forbid, but there you are, you've lost your right mind, and we find you running naked out in the little cemetery here in Heritage Lake, and we call Sheriff Ken. He comes and he pulls you away, and you break your chains, and you come back, and you're still running around naked out there, and you're screaming in voices that are not earthly, and this goes on for years and years until everybody knows you as the person who's running around screaming naked in the cemetery. Now imagine now that, wow, thank God, something puts you back in your right mind. How would you feel? Can you imagine like quietly putting your house up for sale and moving before you have to face anyone? You know, can you imagine, you know the label, people have felt this way for a lot less. You would just want to get out of Dodge and not face anyone. Not surprising, this guy, when you think of it, not only has he lost the horror of the demons, he's found the beauty of God here on earth. If you meet God on earth after that especially, wouldn't you want to go with him? And wouldn't he want to take you? I mean, he said, everybody he meets, follow me, follow me, follow me. And then we find this unexpected thing. This guy's begging Jesus to go with him, and he says, no, sorry, you can't go. You got to stay. What's up with that? What's going on here? Well, the truth is that this guy wanted to run away. He wanted to leave behind. Hey, these people here, I want to go somewhere they don't know me. Ever feel that way? I want to go somewhere they don't know me. And Jesus says, no, you've got to stay. Why would he do that? Well, there's a couple of things going on here. First is Jesus was interested in making this guy whole. So far he delivered him, but he hadn't made him whole. When Jesus Christ comes into us and we're healed and he's making us whole, you know what's involved with becoming whole? Facing your demons. Everyone to be whole must face their own demons. Now for us, some of that might be literal, but it's definitely at least figurative. There are things we have done that we're not proud of, and boy, we just kind of like to forget. We say, well, God forgives me, but yeah, God forgives you, but you still have things you have to correct. There are things that still have to be answered. God has a family, given you a family that you're raised in. There's different ways, but there is a place where you are, and you may feel like running away, but you have to face your demons. You know who could really take a lesson on this is the church, especially in America. Because the way we are is like this. Here is the way this can roll. You come to a church, wherever church, and it seems like a pretty good place, and you get to know people a bit. And you know, it takes time to really get to know someone, doesn't it? You know, as you go on, dynamics change in the mesh of things. And there'll be people, they'll get in there somewhere around 4, maybe 5 years. They'll hit some barb in their own personality that'll rub a barb in someone else's personality. And instead of dealing with it, I don't like that church anymore, I'm going somewhere else. And you know what happens? Well, sometimes they don't go anywhere. But what will happen, they'll go to another church and they'll get in there around 4 or 5 years. They'll run into the same dynamic, the same demon, and off they go somewhere else. And maybe again, they never learn. They never learn. Yeah, sure, they're not all in the blame or whatever. All I'm saying is there's an area where they need to grow up, or an area where they need to deal with a demon, and they don't have to, they just simply run away. Well, Jesus and I are getting in the boat and we're going to another church. That's what we're doing. But Jesus said, no, if at some point you need to grow up, at some point I need to grow up more as myself. I need to stay in there where he puts me and grow up a little bit. I can't be running away. However, that's the first part of that. You start where you are. But the man immediately did move. Now, did you notice? He was living in the graveyard. He was hanging out with the dead. But as soon as he's in his right mind, he goes to the town. He gets out of the graveyard. Well, how does that apply? Well, think of it in this term. Take people who maybe they're in this pattern of destructive relationships of some kind. They just seem to roll with these. Or maybe something like substance abuse. They're into that. Usually those things go together. And they're delivered. God delivers them from their demons. They come somewhere, they see a new way of thinking, the transformation is starting to take root, but they refuse to leave the graveyard. They keep hanging, they keep playing with the dead. Well, who are the dead? What are you talking about? Well, those people who support and foster the things that have killed them in the first place. They don't leave the substance abuse. They stay with the same bad influence. They stay in the same bad social circles. Well, shouldn't they be witnessing there? That's not the time to witness there for that person. They need to get out of the graveyard. They need to go somewhere where there's life. And what happens if they stay in the graveyard? The dead simply pull them back into the grave with them. There's a time, you don't run away, but you do need to move. You need to move where God is putting you, and that will be out of the graveyard. And there's where we come into the real triumph of what goes on here. All of this is an amazing story, but it really doesn't hit the punchline until you get to the end of it, where it says, so the man went away, as he was told in obedience. The man went away and told all over town, not in the graveyard, all over town, how much Jesus had done for him. It comes down to this. You can't go wrong with this, is obedience. Everything hinges on obedience. This guy, once he was delivered, everything became a question of obedience. The number 4 thing here, and it dovetails a little bit from this, is start seeking and never stop. Start seeking and never stop. You know, it's one of the great misnomers, I think, is we did a real disservice in the church with the term seeker. If I were to say today, we're having a seeker service, I would guarantee for most of us automatically what would come in our head. Oh, well, that's for those people who've been flirting with the idea of God, but they're not quite there yet, so we try and do something where we're reaching them. And if I said I was, you know what, I'm a seeker, you know, you might think, okay, there's somebody who, they're entertaining God, but they're not really quite there. What a terrible removal from the theology of what a seeker really is in Scripture. I'm not saying that's great, people are seeking, but that's not a theology to go by. Matthew 6, Jesus is talking about why not to worry about things like they do in this world. He talks about the flowers and Solomon's robes and all of this stuff. And he gets down to the punchline of what he's really talking about around Matthew 6:32. He says, for the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But here comes the instruction. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. All that stuff will be added. Seek first a relationship with God. Seek first what God is trying to tell you. You know what? Every service should be a seeker service. Every person who would bear the name of Christ should be a seeker, heart, mind, and soul, because you never stop seeking. You're seeking what will benefit in His kingdom. You're seeking what the next step is for you in your obedience. You're seeking what God will do in this situation or that situation. We never stop seeking. We never stop seeking. But I wonder if that's really true of us. Sometimes we start seeking other things because There are times that when we seek and God answers and we follow, take this guy, it sounds like he really got jilted, didn't it? It kind of sounds that way. Here he is. He could have had a mountaintop experience for the next 3 years. Just imagine, he leaves behind the demons, he goes, meets new people, and he's a rock star with Jesus across on the other side of the shore where nobody knows him. What a promotion in life that would be from a human standard. But instead, he's told, no, you have to stay here and face the music. You have to stay here in this place, and then this is where you can make the most of your life. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? And sometimes we're like that. What if when God tells you the thing that will make the most of your life is don't take the job promotion? That, it's going to cause such compromise in your spiritual life. Don't do that. Stay where you are. Or somebody brought up in the earlier service pointing to the fact of missionaries. Think of how missions has gone over the years. There are people who lived in the most industrialized, the most affluent nation, and they go somewhere to live in a grass hut where they'll probably get malaria and be sick for the rest of the life. What's that all about? How is that moving ahead? Sometimes to make the most of your life is to do something that seems less, according to our standards, but not according to God's. How so? How can that work? Well, if it's eternity and eternal life we're talking about, Matthew 8:36, Jesus puts it in perspective like this. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory and the holy angels. Ashamed of him and his teachings. That isn't necessarily getting red-faced when somebody points out you're a Christian. This ashamed of his teaching could be, you know what? I'll have to sell my soul a little bit, but I'm going to take this promotion, or I'm going for this job, or I'm going to do this. I might have to give up a little bit of what I know Christ would want to be doing in my life, but I'm going to get this instead. A shame can take some very subtle colors, some very subtle flavors in this. What good is that job promotion? What good is selling your soul to earn a few more dollars or to be more comfortable or more secure, whatever you want to take, if it costs you your soul? It costs eternity. So, no, sometimes it can almost seem like a step back, but it really isn't. You know what? Every one of us are like this man of the tomb. Every one of us was born into a graveyard, and every one of us has played with the dead. That's what the fallen nature is. It is spiritually dead. Are we in a position to do something more now? Say, well, I'm not in that graveyard anymore. I am spiritually alive. Well, that is great. But how do you go from here to making the most of the rest of your life? Now, we could probably add other things in here and come up with all kinds of sage advice. All I'm telling you, if we look at this worst case scenario and how it turns out, a man once possessed does make the most of the rest of his life. Jesus didn't, I left this part out, Jesus also didn't abandon this guy. He equipped him before he left him there. This man now had a first-hand experience. There's something we dare not forget. A first-hand of experience of what God can do in a life. And then he went and told that story. He was equipped to do. It might have been painful, it might have been humbling, but he was equipped to do it. And God does that type of thing. So these 4 things we can learn from this man who was a worst case scenario in making the most of your life and my life. 1, start at the feet of Jesus. And if you're smart, you will stay there. 2, be fueled by real transformation. Don't fake it. Don't just try to be churchy. Be fueled by real transformation. 3, move in obedience. And that may mean start where you are and move a little, and maybe then be moving a lot, but never, wherever God moves, never be running away. Never run away. And 4, never stop seeking. No matter where you were, even if you achieved everything God had for you at this point in your life, there's still another step for you. And you might ask, how do you know there's another step for me? Because you're still breathing. As long as you're on this earth, God has something for you to do. So always keep seeking. What is the next step He has for me? Now, I take all of this now and just turn it around into a challenge a little bit, and that'll fit in with even your next step cards. But this, here they are. Start at the feet of Jesus. Be fueled by transformation. Move, but don't run away. Never stop seeking. If you take just those 4 things, how well does your life align with those? How much of an alignment of position are you in right at this moment to make the most of the rest of your life? Because the truth is, if this guy could do it, anybody can. But are we aligned to make the most of the rest of our life? Because it is possible.
I am not afraid. This man of sorrows took my pain. He comes to take away our sin and bear its marks upon His skin. I'm telling you this story because man of the tombs I was. Man of the tombs I was.